The Black Knight Satellite. In December of 1998, the crew of Space Shuttle mission STS-88 was conducting the first assembly operations for the International Space Station. The mission was historic. Two modules were being joined together in orbit for the first time. Astronauts were outside the shuttle performing spacewalks. The cameras were running. And in several photographs taken during those spacewalks, a dark object appears. It is not the shuttle. It is not the space station module. It is not any piece of equipment the crew had brought with them. It is a dark, elongated shape. Irregular. Positioned against the white curvature of Earth below. In some photographs it appears almost triangular. In others it resembles something mechanical, with angles that do not suggest a random piece of debris. NASA has an explanation. They say it is a thermal blanket. A piece of insulating material that was lost during one of the spacewalks and drifted away from the shuttle. It is catalogued in the NORAD debris tracking system as object number 25570. A thermal blanket. That is the official answer. But the Black Knight satellite is not a story that begins in 1998. It is a story that begins nearly a century earlier. With a man working alone in a laboratory in Colorado. And with signals that he could not explain. And that no one, in the century that followed, has fully explained either. Before we go further, something important needs to be said. The Black Knight satellite, as a unified concept, is partly myth. The name itself was not used consistently until the Internet era. Several separate and unrelated events were, over time, woven together into a single narrative about a 13,000-year-old alien satellite that has been orbiting Earth since before recorded human history. Some of those events have mundane explanations. Some of them do not. This is a story about the ones that do not. Because underneath the mythology, there are documented incidents. Government records. Astronaut testimony. Military tracking data. Newspaper reports from before the space age even began. And those incidents, stripped of the mythology surrounding them, remain genuinely unresolved. Let us go through them in order. The year is 1899. Nikola Tesla is working at his experimental station in Colorado Springs, Colorado. He is one of the most brilliant scientific minds of his era. He has already developed alternating current, contributed to the foundations of radio transmission, and proposed ideas that will not be taken seriously for decades. At Colorado Springs, he is working on wireless transmission of electrical energy over long distances. He has built a massive Tesla coil. He is conducting experiments that his contemporaries consider either visionary or dangerous, depending on how generously they regard him. In the summer of that year, Tesla records something in his journals that he cannot explain. He is monitoring his equipment when he begins receiving signals. Not random noise. Not atmospheric interference. Regular, repeating, rhythmic signals that appear to follow a pattern. He writes that the signals seem to change in a way that suggests they are being deliberately varied. As if something is transmitting with intention. Tesla becomes convinced he is receiving transmissions from another planet. He writes about it. He speaks about it. He is not a man prone to fantasy, which is precisely why what he says is worth noting. He cannot identify the source. No one ever does. In the context of 1899, the most rational explanation is that Tesla was receiving signals from a natural source he did not have the framework to understand. Pulsars, for example, were not discovered until 1967. Jupiter emits powerful radio waves that have confused researchers for generations. Natural sources of repeating electromagnetic signals exist throughout the universe. But Tesla's certainty was unusual. His description of the signals as intentionally varied, deliberately patterned, was not the language of a man describing noise. What he heard at Colorado Springs remains, technically, unexplained. The year is 1954. It is 3 years before Sputnik. The space age has not yet begun. No human being has placed any object in orbit around Earth. The concept of an artificial satellite exists in scientific and military discussions, but no such thing exists in the sky. In February of that year, newspapers across the United States publish an extraordinary claim. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch and the San Francisco Examiner both report that the United States Air Force has detected 2 unidentified satellites in orbit around Earth. Not 1. 2. The reporting cites Major Donald Kehoe, a former Marine Corps aviator who had become one of the most prominent researchers of unidentified aerial phenomena in the United States. He claims the Air Force has confirmed the detection of these objects. The Air Force neither confirms nor denies the reports with any clarity. The objects are described as moving in polar orbits, circling Earth from north to south rather than east to west, which is the natural direction for objects launched from Earth's surface to take advantage of the planet's rotation. At that moment in history, no country on Earth had the technology to launch a satellite. And no country had launched one. Sputnik would not go up until October of 1957. What were those 2 objects? The Air Force never provided a documented answer. The reports were not retracted. They were simply absorbed into the noise of a decade full of unexplained aerial reports, brushed aside without formal explanation, and eventually forgotten by everyone except the researchers who kept reading. Sputnik launched on October 4, 1957. The space age began. The race between 2 superpowers to dominate the sky was now official and urgent. In 1960, something new appeared. The United States Navy, using the newly established Space Surveillance Network, detected an object in orbit. The object was in a polar orbit. High altitude. Moving in a pattern inconsistent with any known satellite. The problem was this: neither the United States nor the Soviet Union had the capability, in 1960, to place an object in polar orbit. The technology did not yet exist in either country's arsenal. Polar orbit requires a specific type of launch that was not yet operational. Time magazine ran a story. The object was real. The tracking was real. And no one could explain what it was or who had put it there. The eventual official explanation was that the object was a fragment from the Discoverer satellite program. A piece of an American reconnaissance satellite that had gone astray and settled into an unexpected orbit. Researchers who looked at the tracking data pointed out problems with this explanation. The orbit of the detected object did not match the orbital trajectory of any known lost Discoverer fragment. The altitude was wrong. The inclination was wrong. The Discoverer explanation was never formally verified in documentation that matched the specific orbital parameters of what was detected. The object was tracked for weeks. Then it disappeared from tracking. And the official record closed the question without fully answering it. On May 15, 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper lifted off from Cape Canaveral aboard Faith 7. Cooper was a veteran Air Force test pilot. One of the original Mercury 7 astronauts. A man trained for precision observation, with the kind of professional credibility that was not easily dismissed. During his final orbit of Earth, Cooper reported seeing a glowing object ahead of his capsule. He described it as greenish, luminous, moving toward him and then away. What made this report different from other astronaut sightings was what happened next. The tracking station at Machia, Australia confirmed the sighting on radar. This is not a report that exists only in Cooper's testimony. Ground-based radar tracked something in the area Cooper described. The object was real enough to appear on military tracking equipment operated by personnel who had no reason to fabricate what they recorded. NASA's public response to the sighting was minimal. The incident was reported by the media and then effectively closed without formal explanation. Cooper spent the rest of his life insisting that what he saw was real and unidentified. He testified before the United Nations on the subject. He did not retract his account. The radar confirmation from Machia, Australia has never been formally explained by any official body. In 1973, a Scottish author and researcher named Duncan Lunnan published an article in the Journal of the British Interplanetary Society. The article proposed something extraordinary. Going back to the 1920s and 1930s, radio operators across Europe had been reporting a phenomenon known as long-delay echoes, or LDE. When they transmitted a radio signal, they would receive their own signal back, but delayed. Not by the fraction of a second expected from atmospheric reflection. By seconds. Sometimes by many seconds. Up to 15 seconds of delay. The physics of the time had no satisfying explanation for this. A signal traveling at the speed of light does not simply delay for 15 seconds without something intercepting it and sending it back. Lunnan took the recorded data from the long-delay echo reports of the 1920s and re-examined them. He plotted the pattern of the delays as a two-dimensional graph. What he found, he claimed, was a star map. Specifically, a star map of the constellation Boötes as it would have appeared 13,000 years ago. The map pointed to Epsilon Bootis, a double star system approximately 203 light-years from Earth. Lunnan's interpretation was that something was in orbit around Earth. Something that had been there for 13,000 years. Something that had intercepted the early radio transmissions of humanity and responded with a map of where it had come from. This became the 13,000-year figure that is now attached to the Black Knight satellite in almost every version of the story. Lunnan himself later walked back his interpretation. He identified errors in his original analysis and publicly stated that the star map conclusion was not supported by the data as rigorously as he had initially believed. He retracted the claim. But the mythology had already spread. And the 13,000-year figure, detached from its retraction, became one of the foundational elements of the Black Knight narrative that followed. Back to the STS-88 photographs from 1998. NASA's explanation is a thermal blanket. Object 25,570 in the NORAD catalog. Tracked debris. Accounted for. Several researchers have pointed to specific problems with this explanation. The shape of the object in the photographs does not match the shape of a standard thermal blanket that has been tumbling in microgravity and photographed from a moving shuttle. Thermal blankets, when they drift and tumble, tend to fold and compress in irregular ways. The object in the STS-88 photographs has consistent angles. Hard edges that appear in multiple photographs taken from different positions. The object appears in images taken at different points during the spacewalk. Its apparent position relative to Earth's horizon is inconsistent with an object that is tumbling freely. A freely tumbling piece of debris changes its apparent orientation significantly between photographs taken minutes apart. The NORAD catalog entry for Object 25570 was created after the STS-88 mission. There is no corresponding pre-existing tracking record for the object before the photographs were taken. None of this proves the object was not a thermal blanket. But the thermal blanket explanation was accepted quickly and without the kind of detailed optical analysis that the photographs would seem to warrant, given that they show an unidentified object in orbit during a historic NASA mission. The photographs exist. They are not disputed. What they show is disputed, and will likely remain so. Let us separate what is documented from what is mythology. The documented incidents are these. Nikola Tesla, in 1899, reported receiving regular, patterned signals that he could not identify and that he described as intentionally varied. No official explanation for what he received has ever been formally established. In 1954, before any satellite had been placed in orbit by any country, American newspapers reported that the Air Force had detected two objects in polar orbit. The Air Force did not formally refute these reports or provide a documented explanation for what was detected. In 1960, the United States Navy detected an object in polar orbit that could not be accounted for by the satellite programs of either superpower. The discoverer fragment explanation offered did not match the tracking parameters of the detected object. The object disappeared from tracking and the case was closed without resolution. In 1963, astronaut Gordon Cooper reported a luminous object during his final orbit. Ground-based radar at Machia, Australia confirmed something in the area. Cooper maintained this account until his death. No official explanation was ever provided for the radar confirmation. In 1998, astronauts aboard STS-88 photographed a dark, angular object during a spacewalk. NASA identified it as a lost thermal blanket. Researchers have questioned whether the shape and positional consistency of the object matches that explanation. These are not myths. They are documented events with official explanations that range from plausible to unconvincing. What is myth is the synthesis, the idea that all of these events refer to the same object, that the object is 13,000 years old, that it came from Epsilon Boötis, and that it has been monitoring Earth since before recorded history. Duncan Lunnan retracted his star map claim. The 13,000-year figure has no verified scientific foundation. But the individual incidents, each standing alone, have not been resolved. There is a question worth asking at the end of all of this. Why would a polar orbit be so significant? In 1954 and 1960, polar orbit was the detail that made the detections anomalous. Neither superpower had the capability. The physics of launching into polar orbit require a trajectory that was not yet within either program's operational reach. Polar orbit has a specific property that other orbits do not. An object in polar orbit will eventually pass over every point on Earth's surface. Not some points. Every point. As the Earth rotates beneath it, a polar orbit object will, over time, observe the entire planet. If something wanted to monitor everything. If something had been placed in orbit not to communicate, not to intercept, but to watch, a polar orbit would be the correct choice. This is not evidence of anything. But it is a detail that sits uncomfortably alongside the other details of this case. A polar orbiting object detected before the space age. Detected again at the beginning of the space age. An orbit designed for total planetary observation. And then, almost 40 years later, photographs of something dark and angular in orbit that the official explanation describes as a lost thermal blanket. What do we know for certain? We know that Nikola Tesla received signals in 1899 that he could not explain and that were not explained by anyone who came after him. We know that in 1954, before any satellite existed, objects in polar orbit were reportedly detected and never formally accounted for. We know that in 1960, something in polar orbit was tracked by the United States Navy and the explanation provided did not match the tracking data. We know that astronaut Gordon Cooper reported a luminous object in orbit that was confirmed on radar by a ground station in Australia. We know that photographs from STS-88 show an unidentified dark object in orbit that NASA says is a thermal blanket and that some researchers say does not match that description. What we do not know is whether any of these incidents are connected. What we do not know is what, if anything, has been in polar orbit around this planet at various points in the last century. What we do not know is whether the consistent official explanations that close each of these cases without fully resolving them are the product of genuine investigation, or something else. The mythology of the Black Knight satellite is larger than the evidence. But the evidence, even without the mythology, is larger than the official record admits. Something was detected. Several times. Over several decades. By different people. Using different instruments. In different countries. And the answers provided each time were answers that raised more questions than they closed. That is not proof of anything extraordinary. But it is a pattern. And patterns, in the absence of explanation, are all we have. The signal is still out there. Whatever it is.